A bustling afternoon at the city park brought a sense of calm to those enjoying the sunshine. Kids laughed as they chased each other near the swings, couples strolled hand in hand along the paths, and joggers made their way through the winding trails. Among them, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a neatly pressed military uniform walked quietly, carrying an air of dignity. His name was Marcus Hill, a decorated black soldier who had served his country with unwavering loyalty and courage. Today, however, he wasn't here for recognition or a medal. He was just another citizen enjoying a rare day off. As Marcus stopped near a shaded bench, a little boy, no more than 6 or 7, ran up to him, wide-eyed and brimming with curiosity. "Are you a real soldier?" the boy asked, his small hand pointing to Marcus's uniform. Marcus crouched down, his warm smile matching the sincerity in his voice. "Yes, I am," he said gently. The boy's face lit up, and he quickly saluted Marcus in an admirably clumsy manner. The interaction drew smiles from those nearby, but not everyone was amused. A sharp voice cut through the pleasant chatter. "Well, isn't this something?" the woman said, her tone dripping with disdain. Heads turned as a middle-aged woman, elegantly dressed but with a stony expression, approached Marcus. Her sharp heels clicked against the pavement, each step carrying an air of superiority. "You sure wear that uniform like you own it," she added, her eyes narrowing as they fixed on him. Marcus stood up, towering over her, but his demeanor remained calm. "I do wear it with pride, ma'am," he replied evenly. His voice was measured, respectful, yet firm. The woman's lips curled into a smirk. "Pride? In what exactly? You don't represent the United States," she said loudly enough for the growing crowd to hear. "People like you, you're an embarrassment to our country." A hush fell over the park as her words echoed in the air. Some people looked away, uncomfortable with the confrontation, while others stared in shock. Marcus remained silent for a moment, his jaw tightening as he processed the insult. The weight of her words hung heavy, not just for him, but for everyone watching. This wasn't the first time Marcus had encountered such ignorance, but that didn't make it any less painful. Before Marcus could respond, a young woman stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "How can you say something like that? He's a soldier. He's probably done more for this country than you ever will," she snapped. But the woman waved her off dismissively, her focus never leaving Marcus. "I have every right to speak my mind," she retorted, "and I'm not about to let someone like him claim to represent my America." Marcus raised a hand, signaling for the young woman to stop. "It's okay," he said softly, though his eyes betrayed a storm of emotions. He turned back to the woman, his voice steady but filled with unspoken hurt. "Ma'am, I've served this country for over a decade. I've worn this uniform in places you'll never have to see, facing things you'll never have to endure, so people like you can say what you want, no matter how wrong or hurtful it might be." The woman's face hardened, but before she could fire back, Marcus's voice grew stronger. "But before you judge me or anyone else who wears this uniform, ask yourself, what have you done for this country? What sacrifices have you made for the freedoms you enjoy every day?" The tension was palpable, the crowd now fully invested in the unfolding drama. Marcus's words struck a chord, but the woman's expression remained defiant. "Don't lecture me," she spat. "You'll never understand what being a real American means." At that moment, Marcus took a deep breath, the weight of her prejudice and the eyes of the onlookers pressing down on him. The next words he would say had the power to either escalate the situation or turn it into something unforgettable. His response, raw and deeply personal, would leave everyone in the park, including the woman, speechless. But what he said wasn't just for her. It was for everyone who had ever questioned his place in the country he had fought so hard to protect. As the crowd leaned in, waiting for his answer, Marcus looked directly at the woman, his eyes filled with a mix of pain, pride, and resolve. And then, with a voice that carried the weight of 1,000 untold stories, he began to speak. Marcus's gaze didn't waver as he stood in silence for a moment, letting the weight of the woman's words settle. Around him, the crowd was utterly still, the warm breeze carrying only the sound of rustling leaves. He knew this wasn't just about him. It wasn't about the uniform or even the woman in front of him. It was about the countless others who had faced similar accusations, the unspoken pain carried by those who had given their all for country, but sometimes struggled to see them as equals. "I want to tell you a story," Marcus finally said, his deep voice steady but filled with emotion. The crowd shifted slightly, their interest peaked. Even the woman, though still wearing a mask of defiance, hesitated. There was something in his tone, something she couldn't ignore. "When I was a kid," Marcus began, "I used to dream about what it meant to be a hero. I'd watch movies and see soldiers running into battle, fighting for something bigger than themselves. It made me believe that wearing this uniform meant you were part of something important, something honorable." His eyes softened, a flicker of nostalgia crossing his face. "But where I grew up, not everyone saw things that way." He paused, letting the words linger as he looked out over the crowd. "I grew up in a small town in Georgia. My mom worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, and my dad." He trailed off for a moment, swallowing hard. "My dad was killed when I was 10 years old. He wasn't in the military. He was just a man trying to protect his family. One night, someone decided he didn't belong in the neighborhood he was driving through. They thought he looked suspicious. And so they stopped him. Permanently." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of shock and quiet sympathy. Marcus's voice remained steady, though it was clear the memory still weighed heavily on him. "After that, I promised myself I'd do whatever it took to protect my family, my community, my country. I thought joining the military would give me that chance. And it has in many ways, but it's also shown me how deep the scars of division really are." He glanced back at the woman, who now seemed less certain of herself. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, but her eyes revealed a flicker of something else. Maybe doubt, maybe guilt. "When I enlisted," Marcus continued, "I was one of only a handful of black recruits in my unit. I thought we'd all be treated the same, because we wore the same uniform. But I was wrong. Some people couldn't see past the color of my skin, even when we were training side by side, fighting for the same cause." The crowd was utterly silent now, hanging on his every word. Even the children who had been playing earlier were still, their parents holding them close. "I've been called names," Marcus said, his voice growing quieter, but no less powerful. "I've been doubted, overlooked, and even sabotaged by people who were supposed to have my back. But I never let it break me. Because I knew I wasn't just fighting for me. I was fighting for the idea that everyone in this country deserved a chance to belong." He turned slightly, addressing the crowd as much as the woman in front of him. "This uniform isn't just fabric and medals. It represents sacrifice, courage, and a belief in something greater than ourselves. I've seen men and women of every race, religion, and background put their lives on the line for this country. And let me tell you, when you're in the middle of a firefight, no one cares what color your skin is. They care about whether you've got their back." The woman shifted uncomfortably, her earlier confidence visibly cracking. But Marcus wasn't finished. "I've been deployed 3 times, he said, his voice growing stronger. "I've seen friends come home in caskets, draped in the flag of a country they loved more than life itself. I've written letters to grieving families, explaining how their son or daughter gave their life to protect strangers they'd never meet. And every time I do, I wonder if those families will face the same kind of hate and ignorance I've faced." A few people in the crowd wiped their eyes, the emotion in Marcus's words striking a chord. But Marcus didn't look for sympathy. He was speaking from his heart, and it showed. "I don't know what you've been through, ma'am," he said, turning back to the woman. "Maybe you've lost someone too. Maybe you've been hurt in ways I can't understand. But I can tell you this, hatred doesn't fix anything. It doesn't bring people back, and it doesn't make you stronger. All it does is divide us even more." The woman's lips parted as if she were about to speak, but no words came out. Her face was flushed, her hands clenching and unclenching at her sides. Marcus could see the inner conflict playing out behind her eyes. He knew she wasn't ready to admit she was wrong, not yet, but he hoped his words would stay with her, maybe even change her heart someday. I don't represent a perfect country, Marcus said, his voice softer now. But I represent a country that's always trying to be better. I represent the people who believe in justice, equality, and the idea that everyone deserves a chance to be heard. And whether you like it or not, Mom, I represent you too. Because that's what being a soldier is about. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stood tall, his expression calm but resolute, as the weight of his words settled over the park. The woman's face was a mixture of anger, shame, and something else, something harder to define. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, unable to form a response. The crowd, too, seemed frozen in place, caught between the raw emotion of Marcus's story and the unresolved tension of the moment. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of a bird chirping broke the silence, but it did little to ease the heaviness in the air. Marcus didn't wait for the woman to respond. Instead, he took a step back, his gaze sweeping over the crowd as if to say, "This isn't just about me, it's about all of us." And with that, he turned and began to walk away, leaving behind a park full of people who would never forget what they had witnessed. The story wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now, the message had been delivered. And as Marcus disappeared into the distance, the crowd was left with a lingering question that none of them could ignore. What kind of country do we want to be? As Marcus walked away, the park seemed to exhale collectively. Conversations that had stopped mid-sentence slowly resumed, but they were quieter now, more subdued. The woman remained rooted in place, staring at the spot where Marcus had stood moments ago. Her chest rose and fell as though she were struggling to catch her breath, her mind replaying his words over and over again. A man in the crowd, dressed in casual jeans and a baseball cap, stepped forward. His name was Daniel, a retired firefighter who had come to the park to read. But now, the book in his hands was forgotten. He approached the woman cautiously, his voice low but firm. "You know, he's right," Daniel said. "That man has done more for this country than most of us ever will. Maybe it's time you think about why his presence bothers you so much." The woman whipped her head around, her eyes narrowing. "You don't know me," she snapped. "You don't know what I've been through or why I feel the way I do." Her voice trembled, not with anger, but with something deeper, fear, perhaps, or guilt. "You're right," Daniel replied evenly. "I don't know your story, but I know hate when I see it, and I know it never leads anywhere good." The woman's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. She turned and walked briskly toward the park gate, her heels clicking loudly against the pavement. As she disappeared from view, Daniel sighed and shook his head. The encounter had left a bitter taste in his mouth, but there was something else too, a sense of unfinished business. Meanwhile, Marcus had made his way to a quieter part of the park, far from the stares and whispers of the crowd. He sat down on a bench beneath an old oak tree, the weight of the confrontation settling heavily on his shoulders. He wasn't angry, not anymore. He was tired. Tired of fighting battles that felt as endless as they were invisible. As he stared at the ground, a soft voice broke the silence. "Excuse me, sir." Marcus looked up to see the young boy from earlier standing a few feet away, clutching a small notebook and a pen. His mother stood a short distance behind him, watching nervously. "Can I ask you something?" The boy continued, his voice timid but curious. Marcus nodded, forcing a small smile. "Of course." The boy hesitated, then held out the notebook. "Can you sign this? I want to show my friends that I met a real hero." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the chest. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. Finally, he took the notebook and pen, his hands moving automatically as he scrawled his name across the page. "What's your name?" he asked, handing the notebook back. "Tommy," the boy replied, his eyes shining with admiration. "Well, Tommy," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat, "you don't need to meet a soldier to find a hero. Sometimes heroes are just people who stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." Tommy nodded solemnly, as though the weight of Marcus's words had sunk in. "I'll remember that," he said quietly before running back to his mother. She gave Marcus a grateful smile before leading Tommy away. As they disappeared into the distance, Marcus leaned back against the bench, his thoughts swirling. The boy's innocence had been a stark contrast to the hatred he faced earlier, a reminder of both the hope and the challenges that came with being part of a diverse and imperfect nation. He wanted to believe that the future could be different, that kids like Tommy would grow up in a world where people were judged by their character, not their skin color. But he knew that change didn't come easily. Back at the park's entrance, the woman had stopped just outside the gate. She leaned against a lamppost, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her mind was racing, her emotions a chaotic swirl of anger, shame, and something she couldn't quite name. She hated the way Marcus's words had made her feel, as though he'd reached into the darkest corners of her soul and held up a mirror. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of another woman, this one older, with kind eyes and a soft voice. "Are you all right?" the woman asked gently. The younger woman straightened, forcing a tight smile. "I'm fine," she said quickly. I don't know why everyone is making such a big deal about him. He's just one guy." The older woman tilted her head, studying her for a moment before replying. "He's not just one guy. He's someone who's carried more on his shoulders than most of us can imagine. And you," she paused, her tone soft, appointed. "You're carrying something too, aren't you?" The younger woman's facade cracked, just for a moment. Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly. "I don't know what you're talking about," she muttered, turning away. The older woman didn't press her. Instead, she said quietly, "Sometimes the hardest thing to face is the truth about ourselves. But it's the only way we can grow." As the older woman walked away, the younger one remained frozen in place, her mind churning. She didn't want to admit it, but something about Marcus's words, and now this stranger's, was beginning to gnaw at her. For years, she clung to her beliefs, convinced they were justified. But now, for the first time, she wondered if she'd been wrong. Elsewhere in the park, Daniel found himself walking toward the bench where Marcus sat. He hadn't planned to approach him, but something compelled him to. As he got closer, he noticed the deep lines of exhaustion etched into Marcus's face. He cleared his throat gently, and Marcus looked up. "Mind if I sit?" Daniel asked. Marcus gestured to the empty spot beside him. "Go ahead." The two men sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the park fading into the background. Finally, Daniel spoke. "I just wanted to say, what you did back there, standing up like that, it was powerful. I don't know if that woman heard you, really heard you, but the rest of us did. And it mattered." Marcus gave a small nod, his expression thoughtful. "I don't do it for recognition," he said quietly. "I do it because it's the right thing to do." But sometimes, he trailed off, shaking his head. "Sometimes it feels like no matter what I say or do, it's never enough." Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I know what you mean. I spent 20 years as a firefighter, saved lives, saw things I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. And there were days when I wondered if it was worth it. But then I'd remember the people who thanked me, the ones who reminded me why I started in the first place. Those are the ones who make it matter." Marcus considered this a flicker of hope breaking through his weariness. He didn't know if the woman from earlier would ever change her perspective. But maybe, just maybe, his words had planted a seed, and for now, that was enough to keep him going. As Marcus sat on the bench, the weight of the day pressing heavily on him, a familiar voice called out from behind. He turned to see Staff Sergeant Elena Martinez, a fellow soldier and one of his closest friends in the service, walking toward him. She was dressed in civilian clothes, her posture as straight and confident as ever, but her eyes carried a warmth that immediately eased some of the tension in Marcus's chest. "I thought that was you," Elena said with a small smile, taking the seat beside him. "You have a knack for being in the middle of things, don't you?" Marcus chuckled softly, though the sound was tinged with exhaustion. "You could say that. How much of that mess did you see?" "Enough," Elena replied, her tone shifting to something more serious. You handled it well, Marcus. Better than most would have. He didn't respond right away, staring at the ground as the breeze rustled the leaves above them. Sometimes I wonder if it even makes a difference, he admitted after a moment. People like her. They're so set in their ways. What's the point in trying to reach them? Elena placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm but comforting. The point isn't just to change her, Marcus. It's to show everyone else watching that hate doesn't get the last word. You might not see the impact right away, but trust me, it's there. Marcus nodded slowly, her words sinking in. Before he could respond, though, a commotion broke out near the park's entrance. Voices were raised, sharp and urgent, and the sound of hurried footsteps filled the air. Marcus and Elena exchanged a glance before rising from the bench and heading toward the noise. When they reached the scene, they saw a small group gathered around the woman from earlier. She was pacing back and forth, her face pale and her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. "It's my son," she was saying, her voice high-pitched and frantic. "He's in trouble. I don't know what to do." The crowd parted slightly as Marcus and Elena approached, their uniforms commanding attention even in civilian settings. Marcus stepped forward, his tone calm but authoritative. "What happened?" The woman looked up at him, her eyes wide and brimming with tears. For a moment, she seemed reluctant to speak to him, but desperation overrode her earlier hostility. "He's at the community center," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "There was a fight, and now some guys won't let him leave. They've got weapons." The air around them grew heavy with tension. The mention of weapons sent a ripple of unease through the crowd, but Marcus didn't hesitate. He turned to Elena, who was already pulling at her phone. "Call it in," he said. "I'll go check it out." "I'm coming with you," Elena replied firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. Marcus nodded, and the two of them set off at a brisk pace, the woman trailing a few steps behind. As they approached the community center, the atmosphere grew increasingly charged. The once busy sidewalks were now eerily empty, and the faint sound of shouting could be heard from inside the building. Marcus's senses were on high alert, every nerve in his body tuned to the potential danger ahead. "Stay here," he told the woman, his tone leaving no room for debate. She opened her mouth to protest, but stopped when she saw the determined look in his eyes. Instead, she nodded reluctantly, her hands wringing nervously. Marcus and Elena entered the building cautiously, their movements swift and silent. The sounds of the altercation grew louder as they approached the main hall, where a group of teenagers was clustered near the back wall. In front of them stood two men, both holding what appeared to be makeshift weapons, pipes and wooden bats. One of the teenagers was trying to shield the others, his body language tense but protective. Marcus immediately recognized him from the woman's description. This had to be her son. The boy's face was pale, his eyes darting nervously between the men and his friends. "Hey!" Marcus's voice rang out, firm and commanding. The men turned toward him, their expressions a mix of surprise and defiance. "Whatever's going on here, it ends now." The larger of the two men stepped forward, gripping his pipe tightly. "This ain't your business, soldier," he spat, the word laced with contempt. "Walk away." Elena moved to Marcus's side, her posture equally unyielding. "You're wrong," she said. "When innocent people are involved, it's always our business." The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken threats. Marcus could see the fear in the teenager's eyes, but he also saw something else, hope. They were looking at him as though he were their lifeline, the one person who could pull them out of this mess. "We're not here to fight," Marcus said, his voice steady but unyielding. "But we're not leaving until these kids are safe." The men exchanged a glance, their grip on their weapons tightening. For a moment, it seemed as though the situation might escalate. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he focused on projecting calm authority, his gaze never leaving the men. "Think about what you're doing," he said, his tone low and even. "Whatever this is, it's not worth it. You don't want to be the guy who hurt a bunch of kids, or worse. Walk away while you still can." The larger man hesitated, his jaw clenching as he weighed his options. The The silence stretched on, a room filled with an unbearable tension. Marcus could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, every muscle in his body coiled and ready to act if necessary. Finally, the man lowered his pipe, his shoulders sagging slightly. "Let's go," he muttered to his companion, who looked equally reluctant, but followed his lead. The two men backed away slowly, their footsteps echoing the empty hall as they disappeared through the side door. The teenagers let out a collective breath of relief, their expressions a mix of gratitude and exhaustion. Marcus and Elena quickly moved to check on them, making sure no one was hurt. The boy who had been shielding the others stepped forward, his voice shaky but resolute. "Thank you," he said, his eyes meeting Marcus's. "You saved us." Marcus placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder, his expression softening. "You did good," he said. "You stood up for your friends. That takes courage."